Mafia Boss left a $0 tip. The Black Maid found a secret note under the plate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Victor Hale was the kind of man whose presence quietly rearranged a room the moment he stepped inside, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because everything about him suggested control that never needed to be proven. On a mild Thursday evening in Manhattan, Victor sat alone at a corner table in an upscale restaurant where the lighting was soft, the silverware heavy, and the prices printed small, as if they were a private joke. He ordered simply, spoke little, and watched everything. To the staff, he was just another wealthy diner with an expensive watch and a posture that hinted at authority, though none of them knew his name or the reach of it. When the meal ended, Victor signed the check with a steady hand, stood, and walked out without looking back. Only after the door closed behind him did the silence he left behind begin to loosen. Naomi Carter approached the table the way she approached every task, with care that came from habit rather than hope. She was in her early 30s, wearing the standard black uniform that made everyone like her blend into the background, her natural hair pulled back neatly, her movements precise. Naomi had learned long ago that being overlooked was often safer than being seen. She gathered the plates, wiped the table, and reached for the receipt. Her eyes paused when she saw the tip line. $0. Not a mistake, not a blank space, but a deliberate zero written clearly, confidently, as if it were a statement rather than an amount. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not sharp enough to hurt, but heavy enough to remind her of all the other moments like this, moments that never came with raised voices or insults, just quiet reminders of where she stood in the world. Around her, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, glasses clinking, soft laughter drifting from nearby tables, the host greeting new guests. No one noticed. No one ever did. Naomi folded the receipt and slipped it into her apron, telling herself what she always told herself, that dignity did not depend on generosity from strangers. As she lifted the final plate, something caught her eye, a corner of white peeking out from beneath the rim. She hesitated, then gently slid the plate aside. There, tucked carefully under where the plate had rested, was a small folded note. Naomi stared at it for a moment longer than she meant to, her fingers hovering as if touching it might change something she was not ready to face. Notes were unusual, messages even more so. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it despite how light it was, and slipped it into her pocket without opening it. Whatever it said could wait. Naomi finished clearing the table, straightened the chairs, and moved on to the next task, her face calm, her steps measured. But beneath that practiced composure, her thoughts were no longer on the dining room or the next order. Somewhere between the kitchen and the quiet hallway near the staff lockers, the note rested against her palm, and for the first time that night, the silence left behind by Victor Hale did not feel empty. It felt intentional. Naomi Carter did not open the note right away. She moved through the rest of her shift with the same quiet efficiency she had practiced for years, refilling water glasses, clearing tables, offering polite smiles that rarely met her eyes. The restaurant's air conditioning hummed steadily, keeping the room at a comfortable 72 degrees, but Naomi felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Every time her hand brushed the pocket of her apron, she felt the thin edge of folded paper and wondered why it had been left there at all. A $0 tip was familiar. It was something she had learned to absorb without reaction, like background noise in a busy dining room. But the note was different. It suggested intention, and intention was harder to ignore. By the time the dinner rush slowed and the last dessert plate was sent back to the kitchen, Naomi's shoulders ached from standing, and her feet throbbed inside worn non-slip shoes that had seen too many long nights. She clocked out just after 10:30, the digital screen glowing briefly before going dark, and headed toward the narrow hallway that led to the staff lockers. The sounds of the restaurant faded behind her, replaced by the softer, more honest noises of the building settling for the night. Naomi leaned against the cool metal of her locker and finally took the note out, turning it over once in her fingers. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that did not tear easily, and that detail alone told her more than she expected. She unfolded it slowly. Inside was handwriting that was careful, deliberate, every letter spaced, as if measured. There was no apology written plainly, no explanation offered up front. Instead, the message was short, restrained, and unsettling in its calm. It acknowledged the tip, not as an oversight, but as a choice, and it hinted at a reason Naomi could not yet fully understand. The words suggested observation, as if the man who had left nothing on the table had been watching more than just the meal. Naomi read the note twice, then a third time, her expression unchanged. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply folded the paper back the way she had found it and slipped it into her bag. Outside, the city greeted her with familiar indifference. The sidewalk was still warm from the day's sun, and traffic rolled past in steady waves, headlights reflecting off glass storefronts. Naomi walked toward the subway station, her pace unhurried, blending into the crowd of people heading home from jobs that demanded much and gave little. She thought about rent due at the end of the month, about the bus ride she would take in the morning to her mother's apartment in Queens, about the quiet promise she had made to herself years ago that no matter how small she felt, she would never let bitterness decide who she became. The note weighed on her mind, not because it insulted her, but because it challenged something she believed. She had learned to accept unfairness as a constant, something to navigate rather than confront. This was different. This was personal without being cruel, deliberate without being loud. Somewhere across the city, Victor Hale sat in the back seat of a black sedan, the windows tinted, the hum of the engine steady as it moved through traffic. He did not check his phone. He did not speak. His thoughts were fixed on a single image, the way Naomi Carter had cleared his table without hesitation, without a glance at the receipt until the very end. He wondered if she had noticed the note yet, and if she had, what she would choose to do with it. For the first time in a long while, Victor was not certain which answer he wanted. The next morning began the way most of Naomi Carter's mornings did, quietly and without ceremony. She woke before her alarm, the pale light slipping through the blinds of her small apartment in Queens, illuminating a space that was neat but sparse. A folding table served as both desk and dining area, and a single framed photograph of her mother rested beside the window. Naomi brewed a cup of coffee strong enough to cut through the fatigue still lingering in her shoulders, then sat for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. The note was still in her bag. She had not told anyone about it, not her coworkers, not her mother, because she knew how easily other people's opinions could drown out her own instincts. On the subway ride into Manhattan, the car rocked gently along the tracks, and Naomi watched her reflection in the darkened window. She thought about the years that had led her here, the jobs she had taken because they paid just enough, the opportunities she had stepped away from because survival demanded it. She had once dreamed of finishing school, of working in an office where her hands stayed clean and her name mattered, but life had taught her that dreams were fragile things when rent and medical bills took priority. At the restaurant, the morning prep was already underway. Chairs were being set down, silverware rolled into crisp white napkins, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. Naomi tied her apron and slipped into her role with ease. To most people, she was invisible, another part of the machinery that kept the place running smoothly. That invisibility had been both a shield and a weight. It allowed her to observe without being questioned, to endure without complaint, but it also meant her efforts were rarely acknowledged. As she wiped down the same table Victor Hale had occupied the night before, her movements slowed almost imperceptibly. There was nothing left behind this time. No receipt, no folded paper, just a polished surface reflecting the overhead lights. Naomi reminded herself that whatever meaning the note carried did not change who she was. Her value did not rise or fall based on a stranger's test. Across the city, Victor Hale's day unfolded with precision. Meetings were attended, decisions made, numbers reviewed on screens that represented sums most people would never see in a lifetime. To those around him, Victor appeared composed, untouchable, a man accustomed to being obeyed. Yet beneath that calm exterior, his thoughts returned repeatedly to the waitress whose name he had learned only after leaving the restaurant. Naomi Carter. He had looked her up out of curiosity, not expecting much. and found exactly what he anticipated on paper. No scandals, no dramatic history, just a quiet trail of jobs and addresses that spoke of persistence rather than ambition. The note had been an experiment, a small deviation from his usual certainty. Victor had spent his life measuring people by how they responded to pressure, to loss, to control. Money was the simplest lever, and he had used it countless times. But this felt different. He wondered if Naomi would confront him, if she would ignore the message entirely, or if she would do something unexpected. The question unsettled him more than he liked to admit. Back at the restaurant, Naomi carried a tray of glasses past the host's stand, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She did not know what Victor Hale expected from her, and she did not intend to guess. What she did know was who she was. She was a woman who showed up on time, who worked hard, who treated others with respect even when it was not returned. Whatever game had been set in motion, Naomi was determined to remain herself within it. And in that quiet resolve, something began to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to change the course of both their lives. That evening, the restaurant filled again with its usual blend of quiet luxury and controlled movement, the kind of place where conversation stayed low and expectations stayed high. Naomi Carter moved through the dining room with a tray balanced steadily in her hands, aware of every table without appearing to watch any of them. Her shift had settled into a familiar rhythm when she noticed a reservation name on the seating chart that made her pause for half a second longer than necessary. Victor Hale. The host spoke the name without emphasis, unaware of its weight to Naomi, and led the man to the same corner table as before. Victor arrived alone, dressed with the same understated precision, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Naomi did not react. She continued her work, letting another server take the initial order, observing from a distance the way she had learned to do so well. The hours passed without incident. Plates were delivered, glasses refilled, questions answered politely. Victor ate slowly, methodically, his attention drifting at times to the dining room itself, as if he were listening for something beneath the surface. When the meal ended, Naomi was the one assigned to clear the table. She approached with calm familiarity, her focus on the task rather than the man. Victor stood as she reached the table, nodding once in acknowledgement before leaving without a word. Again, there was no scene, no exchange, just absence. Naomi gathered the plates and reached for the receipt. This time, there was no visible zero written with finality. Instead, the tip line was blank. Naomi felt a quiet shift inside her, not hope, not relief, but awareness. She lifted the plate carefully, and there it was again, another folded note placed with deliberate precision beneath the rim. Naomi's breath slowed as she took it, her fingers steady. She slipped the note into her apron and finished clearing the table, her movements unchanged to anyone watching. In the kitchen corridor, away from the dining room's polished calm, she unfolded the paper. The message was longer this time, still measured, still controlled. It acknowledged her silence from the night before, not as compliance, but as restraint. The words suggested that Victor Hale had been watching her choices more than her service, and that the absence of money was never the point. He wrote of respect as something that revealed itself under pressure, not something purchased. There was no demand, no instruction, only an invitation of sorts, a suggestion that what came next depended as much on her as it did on him. Naomi read the note once, then again, her expression thoughtful rather than offended. She folded it and placed it beside the first one in her bag. For the rest of the shift, she worked with the same quiet diligence, but something inside her had sharpened. This was no longer a test she had not agreed to. This was a conversation unfolding without raised voices or public spectacle. Outside, Victor sat in his car, watching the restaurant through the window as the staff moved inside like figures in a carefully rehearsed play. He felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest, not fear, but anticipation. He had expected anger or confrontation. Instead, Naomi had offered composure. That composure challenged him more than any accusation could have. He wondered if she would continue to say nothing, or if she would choose a response that would force him to listen. Back inside, Naomi clocked out at the end of her shift and stepped into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from a brief earlier rain. She did not feel small. She felt aware. 2 notes now rested in her bag. symbols of a man accustomed to control meeting a woman who understood restraint. Naomi walked toward the subway with measured steps, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by money or silence alone, but by the quiet line she refused to let anyone cross. The following afternoon, Naomi Carter sat at her small kitchen table, the late sunlight stretching across the worn surface as traffic hummed several stories below her window. She had waited until she was home, until the noise of the day had settled, before taking the two notes out of her bag and laying them side by side. Up close, the similarities were unmistakable. The same heavy paper, the same precise handwriting, the same careful economy of words. Naomi read them slowly, not looking for offense, but for meaning. The first had been an observation, the second a continuation, and together they formed something that felt less like a test and more like a mirror being held up to her choices. She thought about all the times she had swallowed unfairness because reacting felt useless, about how often dignity required silence rather than surrender. These notes were written by a man who believed control revealed truth. Naomi believed something else entirely. She folded the papers once more and slid them into her bag, already knowing she would not keep them hidden much longer. The next day at work, the restaurant buzzed with a private event, a lunch reservation booked under a corporate name that drew careful attention from management. Naomi moved through the preparations with her usual calm, though her thoughts were focused, alert. When Victor Hale arrived, he was not alone. Two men followed him, both dressed professionally, both scanning the room with quiet efficiency before taking seats at a nearby table. Victor chose his place without comment, his eyes briefly meeting Naomi's as she passed. There was no surprise in his expression, only recognition. Naomi approached his table when it was time to serve, placing the water glass down with steady hands. Victor looked up at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time rather than observing from a distance. Naomi did not speak. Instead, she reached into her apron and placed the folded notes gently beside his glass. The motion was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Victor's gaze dropped to the papers, then lifted back to her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. The dining room continued around them, soft voices, muted clinks of silverware, the ordinary world unaware of the shift taking place at a single table. Victor picked up the notes and unfolded them slowly. He read them once, then again, his expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Naomi waited, her posture straight, her breathing even. When Victor finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but different from before. He acknowledged that she had understood exactly what he intended, and that she had chosen not to react the way most people would have. Naomi replied simply that respect was not proven by withholding kindness, but by how one behaved when no reward was guaranteed. The words were not sharp, not accusatory, just honest. Victor studied her, considering the space she occupied, not physically, but morally. He realized then that the absence of money had never placed him above her. If anything, it had revealed a line he had not expected her to draw so clearly. He nodded once, a gesture that carried more meaning than any apology spoken aloud. Naomi stepped back, returning to her duties without waiting for further acknowledgement. As she walked away, she felt lighter, not because the situation had resolved, but because she had spoken without raising her voice, had answered a quiet challenge. With quiet certainty, Victor sat back in his chair, the notes resting on the table between his hands. For the first time in a long while, he understood that power did not always belong to the person who set the terms. Sometimes it belonged to the one who refused to be defined by them. Victor Hale left the restaurant that afternoon with the notes folded carefully inside his jacket, not out of sentiment, but because discarding them felt dishonest. The city greeted him with the usual rush of horns and hurried footsteps, yet his attention stayed inward, fixed on a conversation that had unfolded without witnesses. In the back seat of his car, he watched familiar streets pass by and realized how rarely he reconsidered his own methods. Control had always been his language, efficiency his proof of intelligence. Money solved problems. Silence ended debates. Yet Naomi Carter had answered him without either, and the simplicity of it unsettled him. At his office, high above the noise of the city, Victor stood by the window for a long moment before sitting down at his desk. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. He unfolded the notes again, reading the measured lines as if they might change between readings. He recognized himself in the writing, the careful distance, the belief that testing people revealed who they truly were. What he had not expected was to be tested in return. Across town, Naomi finished her shift and took the subway home, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been in days. She did not feel triumphant. She felt settled. The exchange had not elevated her position or improved her pay, but it had affirmed something she protected fiercely. She had spoken without apology, and the world had not collapsed because of it. The following week passed quietly. Victor did not return to the restaurant. Naomi worked her usual hours, greeting guests, clearing tables, maintaining the calm professionalism expected of her. There were no notes, no gestures, no signs that the moment they shared had extended beyond itself. And yet, something had changed. One afternoon, the restaurant manager gathered the staff before service, announcing updated policies regarding tips and employee treatment, citing anonymous feedback from a high-profile client. The changes were subtle but meaningful, clear standards set where ambiguity once lived. Naomi listened without expression, understanding more than anyone else what had prompted the shift. At the same time, Victor sat in a conference room surrounded by advisors, his attention drifting as numbers and projections filled the screen. He found himself asking questions he had never asked before, about processes that affected people he rarely saw, about assumptions he had long accepted without challenge. His team noticed the difference, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he paused before deciding. It was not weakness. It was recalibration. One evening, Victor returned to the restaurant, not as a test, but as a guest. Naomi noticed him as she always did, without urgency. She served his table with the same care she offered everyone else. When the check came, Victor filled it out without ceremony, leaving a tip that reflected not obligation, but intention. There was no note this time. Naomi collected the receipt and moved on, her expression unchanged. Outside, Victor lingered for a moment before entering his car, watching the restaurant's warm lights spill onto the sidewalk. He understood then that respect could not be engineered. It emerged when control loosened its grip and allowed humility to speak. Naomi walked home later that night, the city air cool against her skin, unaware of the quiet decisions unfolding elsewhere because of her restraint. She did not need to know. Her world was defined by what she chose to carry forward, and she carried herself with the same steady dignity that had drawn a line no amount of money could cross. In the spaces where power once went unquestioned, something quieter had taken root, and neither of them would ever move through the world quite the same again. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that felt deceptively ordinary. Naomi Carter continued working her shifts with the same consistency, arriving early, leaving quietly, her presence steady rather than noticeable. The changes announced by management had taken effect in small ways, clearer expectations, firmer boundaries, a tone of respect that did not feel performative. Naomi noticed it most in the pauses, in the way supervisors now chose their words, in the absence of casual dismissals that once passed without thought. She did not claim credit, and no one offered it. That was fine. Her sense of self had never relied on recognition. One evening after closing, Naomi sat with a coworker at a small diner down the block, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee poured without asking. As they talked about rent and family and plans that stayed just out of reach, Naomi listened more than she spoke. She understood how easily moments like hers could be misunderstood, turned into stories about luck or charity. She did not see it that way. What mattered was choice. She had chosen to answer restraint with clarity, and that choice continued to guide her. Across the city, Victor Hale found himself revisiting decisions he had once considered settled. He noticed how often he had relied on silence to assert authority, how rarely he had allowed himself to be questioned without interpreting it as a threat. In meetings, he began asking for perspectives he had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Not because he had softened, but because he had learned that control without awareness was fragile. The memory of Naomi standing across from him, calm and unyielding, surfaced at unexpected moments, not as a challenge, but as a reference point. One afternoon, Victor requested a report on employee turnover at several businesses he frequented, including the restaurant. The numbers told a familiar story, but he read them differently now. Policies were adjusted quietly, without announcements or gestures meant to draw attention. He understood that meaningful change did not require spectacle. Naomi, unaware of the specifics, felt the difference nonetheless. Her days carried less tension, her nights less weight. She began setting aside small amounts of money again. Not much, but enough to remind herself that progress was possible. She called her mother more often, their conversations light, unburdened by complaints Naomi no longer felt the need to voice. One evening, Victor returned to the restaurant for a private dinner. Naomi noticed him, as she always did, and approached when it was time to serve. Their exchange was brief, professional, unremarkable to anyone watching. Yet in that ordinariness, there was mutual acknowledgement. Victor paid, tipped appropriately, and left without lingering. Naomi cleared the table without searching for hidden meaning. Later that night, as she walked home, she reflected on how easily she might have dismissed the notes, how tempting it would have been to ignore them entirely. Instead, she had chosen engagement without submission. That choice had not altered her station overnight, but it had altered her direction. Victor, riding through the city in silence, understood something similar. He had always believed that power was demonstrated by what one could take or withhold. Naomi had shown him that power could also be demonstrated by what one refused to compromise. In the absence of confrontation, they had both learned where they stood. The world around them continued as it always had, loud and uneven, but in the quiet spaces they navigated, respect had found room to exist without being demanded. And that, more than any test or transaction, marked the true shift neither of them could undo. Time moved forward with a quiet inevitability, the kind that did not announce itself but revealed its effects in hindsight. Naomi Carter noticed it one morning when she opened her pay stub and saw a modest but unmistakable increase. Not framed as a bonus, not explained with ceremony, simply there as part of her regular earnings. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her bag, her reaction calm, almost detached. This was not validation. It was alignment. The restaurant itself felt subtly transformed, not brighter, not louder, but steadier. New hires were trained with clearer expectations. Managers corrected behavior that once slipped by unchecked. The unspoken hierarchy that had always hovered in the background felt less rigid, less personal. Naomi moved through her shifts with the same quiet assurance, but now she noticed her coworkers standing a little straighter, speaking a little more freely. None of them knew why things had changed, and Naomi did not tell them. She understood that quiet justice did not need a narrator. Across the city, Victor Hale watched similar patterns unfold in places he influenced but rarely visited. Reports crossed his desk reflecting improved retention, fewer complaints, smoother operations. To an outsider, these were small adjustments, barely worth noting. To Victor, they marked a recalibration of how power could be exercised without erosion. He did not attribute these changes to a single moment, yet his thoughts often returned to the simplicity of that exchange, the way Naomi had returned his notes without accusation, without fear. He realized that the most effective corrections were those that allowed people to retain their dignity while altering behavior. One evening, Victor attended a private charity event, a gathering where generosity was often performative, donations announced aloud for recognition. He wrote a check quietly and declined the acknowledgement offered. The gesture surprised those around him, but Victor did not explain. He had learned that restraint carried its own authority. Naomi, meanwhile, found herself making choices that once felt out of reach. She scheduled a long overdue dental appointment. She replaced her worn shoes before they failed completely. Small decisions, practical ones, yet each carried a sense of control she had not felt in years. On her days off, she walked through her neighborhood with a lighter step, noticing details she once rushed past. She did not think about Victor Hale often. When she did, it was without resentment or gratitude. He was simply a part of a larger lesson, one that affirmed what she had always known but rarely tested. Late one night, Victor returned to the restaurant for a quiet meal, choosing a seat without requesting a specific table. Naomi noticed him and served him as she would anyone else. Their exchange was minimal, a nod, a polite thank you, nothing more. When he left, he did so without leaving a note, without seeking acknowledgement. Naomi cleared the table and found nothing hidden beneath the plate, no message waiting to be interpreted. She felt a quiet satisfaction in that absence. Outside, Victor paused briefly before entering his car, the city's noise wrapping around him as it always had. He understood then that the chapter he had opened had closed on its own terms. Naomi walked home later, the evening air cool against her skin, her bag lighter, without folded papers to carry. Neither of them marked the moment as significant, yet both felt the steady presence of something settled. In a world accustomed to spectacle, they had navigated change through restraint, and in doing so, allowed justice to arrive without demanding attention. The final weeks passed without ceremony, the kind of ending that only revealed its meaning when everything settled into place. Naomi Carter continued her work, but her life no longer felt like something she endured between obligations. She moved with intention now, choosing when to stay late, when to rest, when to say no. The restaurant became a space of routine rather than tension, a place where her effort matched the respect she received, not perfectly, but honestly. One evening, as she wiped down a table near the window, she caught her reflection in the glass and barely recognized the quiet confidence looking back at her. Nothing about her circumstances had dramatically changed, yet everything felt different. She had learned that dignity did not require permission, and that knowledge stayed with her more reliably than any note or gesture ever could. Across the city, Victor Hale stood in his office long after sunset, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. His world remained complex, demanding, shaped by influence and consequence, but something within it had shifted permanently. He no longer mistook silence for agreement, nor restraint for weakness. The memory of a woman who refused to be defined by his expectations had become a quiet standard against which he measured his own choices. When he thought of Naomi, it was not with guilt or pride, but with respect. She had not asked him to change, and that had made all the difference. On a clear Friday night, Victor returned to the restaurant one last time, not to observe, not to test, but simply to eat. Naomi noticed him as she always did, acknowledged him with a nod that carried neither familiarity nor distance. Their exchange was brief, courteous, complete. When he left, Victor paused at the door, glancing back at the dining room where people laughed softly, unaware of the quiet story that had unfolded within those walls. He stepped outside without looking for recognition. Naomi finished her shift later that night and walked home beneath streetlights that hummed steadily overhead. The city felt vast but navigable, no longer something that pressed against her from all sides. She thought about the notes she no longer carried, about how easily she might have accepted the world as it was and kept moving without question. Instead, she had chosen to answer with clarity rather than compliance. That choice had not made her powerful in the way others measured power, but it had made her whole. Somewhere between the subway entrance and her apartment door, Naomi understood that this was the justice she needed, not loud, not public, but lasting. Victor, driving through quiet streets, came to a similar realization. He had learned that influence did not come from what one could withhold, but from what one was willing to acknowledge. The city continued to move around them, indifferent to individual awakenings, yet subtly shaped by them all the same. And in that shared understanding, reached without confrontation or applause, the world remembered something simple and often forgotten, that dignity reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses respect over control.